Okay, well, thank you everyone who was able to join us today. Again, my apologies for the seminar being postponed at the last minute last week due to some technical details. But we're very happy to have Juan here today to present his research about the effects of on export market access on labor market power in Vietnam. Just a quick reminder that the general format here is about a 45-minute presentation, largely uninterrupted, aside from, say, very small kind of clarifying questions. And then we'll do a 15-minute questions and answer period at the end. So thank you very much for joining us today. Looking forward to learning about your paper.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. And thank you, Brian, again, for organizing this seminar series. So today, I'd like to present a paper that examines the effect of the export market access on labor market power using manufacturing firm level data in Vietnam. And this is joint work with Tram Hoang at Federal Reserve Board and Devashish Mishra at Syracuse. So first, I would like to motivate our paper a little bit. So in the past several decades, we've seen significant rise in globalizations. And at the same time, we've seen decline in labor share across many countries, including both developed and developing countries. So when we juxtapose these two trends together, a lot of researchers often think of or hypothesize that trade or globalization as a cause of the decline of labor share across many countries. And this is documented in previous study and in a well-known book by Roderick, 1997. And what is surprising is that in academic literature, especially in trade literature, there's surprisingly little evidence that directly link globalization to trade, at least at micro level, in particular here at firm level. So it wasn't very clear why would global trade lead to a decline in labor share. Without going into further detail of this literature, I'd like to present a simple framework for us to think about this question a little bit. So in these equations in this slide here, I present a simple labor share decompositions derived from firm's cost minimization problem. So in these equations, alpha L is labor share, theta L is output L60 with respect to labor. So think about this as output L60 one can obtain from production function of a firm. Mu here represents distortion in product market. So think about this mu as markup. And chi here is a ratio between MRP and wage, and it represents distortion in the labor market. So when we think about decline of labor share and other macro labor market outcomes, such as inequality, real wage workers, and so on, we often think about costs such as biased technological change would affect this theta L term. Or we think about a lot of attention has also been paid to rising markup, which enters this mu term. Recently, labor market power or labor market distortion has attracted attention because of this chi term here. So change in chi term here can affect labor share and labor market outcomes through this wedge between MRPR and wage. So in the concept of trade and in our paper, what we want to study in this paper is we want to focus on this chi term here. We want to see whether international trade can affect distortion in labor market and affect labor market outcome through the channel. So I will be a little more clear on this chi term, but essentially it's the ratio between marginal revenue product of labor and the wage. In a perfectly competitive labor market, this chi would be equal to 1. But if labor market is distorted, then this ratio would be different from 1. So that's our focus of this paper. Now, our main question in this paper is that we study the effect of a large export shock on firm level labor market distortion in Vietnam. And we build on some previous work, including my own work, which study trade and oligopoly with endogenous entry and exit in China. Specifically, we have 3 questions we want to answer in this study. First, how does an export shock affect labor market power distortion of firm? Second, we explore a little more and ask what are the differential effects on the distortion for men versus women. And here, we're talking about men and women as 2 type workers that are differentiated by the aggregate labor supply elasticity. And third, what are possible practical mechanism or channel in how export shock affect labor market power distortion. And here I cite several literature that relate to this study, but I'll skip the literature and move forward with the paper. Okay, so first a little bit about the context and the export shock that we use in this paper. A lot of us familiar with Vietnam and trade literature would probably know about this trade episode. So the trade episode we use is the US Vietnam bilateral trade agreement that went into force in December 2001, following a formal normalization of diplomatic relation between US and Vietnam in 1995. So following this trade agreement, the US moved Vietnam from column 2 tariffs to column 1 tariffs with no industry-specific negotiations. Column 2 tariffs, the tariff from Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, later assigned to only non-market economies, and column 1 tariff, most favored nation tariffs offered to all WTO members by the US through a multilateral process. So both of these tariff schedules are arguably predetermined, especially from the Vietnam perspective. And this trade episode have been used in some pioneering study, such as study by Marquette 2011 and Marquette and co-author in 2018 and 2022. And so what is significant about this is that US average tariff on the import from Vietnam fell from an average of 23.4% to less than 2.5%. And most of this tariff reduction focused on manufacturing, with the magnitude decrease from about 34% to 3.6%. And these average are the average of 2-digit level that are the tariff level that we will use in later analysis. And to provide a little more context, so panel A show the increase in Vietnamic export to the US. It increased from about $1 billion in 2001 in nominal value to about $40 billion in 2016, more than $40 billion. And most of this focus on manufacturing, illustrated by this dashed line here. And if we run a simple difference in difference model, regress log of export Vietnamese good to US at 10-digit level on the tariffs and plot the coefficients over time, what we see is that the effect of BTA tariffs on Vietnamese export to US is significant and immediate. The effect is strong and immediate and have a long-lasting effect even after more than a decade. So with that in mind, now I would like to move forward to a simple model. And if I'm sorry, I tend to ramble on. So if you have questions, just feel free to ask, or if I cannot answer, I can defer it. Does that sound right? Or yeah, so you can ask questions and interrupt. Okay, so now we would like to present a model to convey intuitions and sort of guide our empirical analysis. So in this paper, we first start with a simple single-factor oligopsony model of local labor markets. So the model assumes that home country is a small open economy. So home firm takes world prices as given in product market. So think about Vietnam as small open economy, and Vietnamese firm doesn't have market power in product market because they take the world price as given to them in product market. There's a continuum of symmetric firms that populate domestic tradable goods sector, and these firms are allocated to a continuum of symmetric local labor market. So we assume symmetry here for simplicity, but one can incorporate some heterogeneity into this model. I also have a paper that in my previous paper, I incorporate heterogeneous firm in Mallet style into this type model. So within each local labor market, the number of firms is finite. And because a firm are finite in a local labor market, this gives firms some market power in the local labor market. And the fact that firms can have market power here is actually coming from the idea that workers in local labor markets subject to some mobility frictions. So we capture this idea that firms are finite and firms have market power in local labor market by specifying an aggregate labor supply curve as in equation 1, where the wage index here is a function of total employment in a local labor market. And this total employment is the sum of employment that across finite number of firms. So here, uppercase N is number of firms in each local labor market. And eta here is aggregate labor supply elasticity. So because number of firms is finite in local labor market, the upward sloping labor supply curve at aggregate level translate to upward sloping labor supply curve at the firm level. So that gives firms some market power in the labor market. So production is standard linear form in labor. And with that, we can come up with affirm the profit maximization problem as in this equation 3. So in this one equations, this is very standard firm maximization problem. The only difference is that when we think about the price of labor, the wage here, instead of wage, now it's a function of employment, not only of firm I, but also all other firms. So this is strategic components, oligopsony component of this problem. So my decision depending on all other firms' decisions when I optimizing, when I make optimal decisions. So that's a key difference with standard firm profit maximization problem. So this is, so we assume the firm play a Cournot game and they choose employment in this game. On the product market side, P bar here is the price that firm sector is given is function of tariff, BTA tariffs. And if BTA tariff increase, a decrease, then the price that perceived by the firm, by Vietnamese firm would increase. So that would end. So product market shock, tariff affect product market, and would transmit that to labor market through this problem of firm. So the first order condition of this problem, you very simple expressions of the distortion that is chi here. That chi term here is the wedge between MRPL and the wage. And this can be shown to be equal to 1 plus 1 over eta time uppercase N. So what this is saying is that the labor market distortion is function of aggregate labor supply elasticity and the number of firm N. So we can solve for equilibrium in this model by free entry conditions. And in this simple model, we can show that when BTA tariff decrease, it would induce entry into labor market, and because uppercase N increase, given the same aggregate labor supply elasticity, then distortion would decrease. So that's the very intuitive, simple model where you have open up to trade, induce entry, and entry induce competition in labor market, and that reduce the distortion. Now, what is also new in this paper is that we extend this simple model into two-factor productions here. So we consider two-type worker, man and woman, as two-factor productions, and we incorporate that into production function with CS form, where LU is number of worker who are men in the total employment, and LV is number of women in firm's labor force. And we specify two aggregate labor supply curve for men and women separately, with eta U is aggregate labor supply elasticity for men, and eta V is aggregate labor supply elasticity for women. And we assume that aggregate labor supply is more elastic for men relative to women. And this is an assumption, but this will be consistent with our empirical measurement later. Now, I think this is a kind of important assumption to clarify a little bit, because so what do we mean by what is captured by this aggregate labor supply elasticity? So generally, if we think about men and women participate, or any type of labor participate in labor market, what is affecting so this elasticity measure the incentive that you need to create for them to participate in labor market. What we're assuming here is that we're assuming women subject to more constraints. So if you want to incentivize women to participate in labor market, you have to increase wage disproportionately more, or for the same change in the wage, then women would be less likely to participate in labor market. And here we think about this as manufacturing formal labor market here. So with this assumption, we can show that from first order condition that the ratio of distortion between men and women can be shown as in this equation 8 here. So 1 plus 1 over eta u times n divided by 1 plus 1 over eta v times n. And with this equation, with assumption eta u greater than eta v, we can show that first, chi u over chi v is smaller than 1. So that means that distortion for women is going to be higher than men. And second, when there's an entry into the market, then the entry would reduce the distortionary gap between men and women. And the idea is that within a local labor market, if both men and women subject to frictions, and if woman is, it's harder to incentivize the certain type of worker, they're subject to maybe social norms, certain constraints that they cannot participate in labor market easily, then the value of entry is very important for those type of worker because they improve welfare, they correct the distortion in labor market for them more rather than the other group. That's the idea of this model. And we will show some of this empirical result that is consistent with this sort of rationale that we provide in this model.
Can I ask the questions? Two.
Yeah.
One is so if there's a change in tariffs, there's going to be a change in the number of firms, and that's going to change distortion. But is there any changes to markup? Markup here is like fixed. Sigma is it's constant.
So markup in this model, so sigma here is more like is a from production function. It's more like elasticity of substitution.
Oh, no, but before, like the slide before, when
yeah.
So there's no so the only thing that's going to change when you have more entry is distortion, not markup.
Yeah. So this change in distortion labor market, distortion in product market is assumed away. So you can assume. So here we assume perfect competition. So basically, firm in Vietnamese firm take work price as given. So there's no markup. But you could assume monopolistic competition, the model would be able to serve, but in that case, markup will also assume constant. So it is possible that the variable markup and markup can change. So we just assume that away because we don't have information in price here that we cannot reliably estimate markup, but markup is certainly possible to change. It just in the case of Vietnamese firm, we would assume that away. And basically, we assume that the other thing that in this model that we're assuming is that we basically say there's a continuum firm in the industries. So that continuum firm basically so we assume that labor market and product market are orthogonal. So labor market is more local and product market is more like nationwide. Yeah. Okay, so that's the idea of the model. The data we use the Vietnamese enterprise surveys, data from 2000 to 2010 that cover all registered enterprise, essentially the formal sectors. And one of the advantages of this data set compared to other data set is that it has comprehensive information about men and women employment composition, so we can explore that information a little more to extend some result in this paper. The local labor market definition we use is 60 province interact with 19 two-digit industry. So each local labor market would be the province interact with the two-digit industries. So one disadvantage of this data set is we don't have wage bills paid separated to these two type of worker, and we would have to estimate that, and I would go over that shortly. The trade data is from US Census, and BTA tariff data is from Marquette and Pagnic 2018.
A small question: why province, not district? Also, why 2 digits? I know that you can go down to 4 digits with the enterprise survey.
Yeah. So the reason is that province, so district would be too small local labor market, that we would not have enough observations to reliably identify the exact number of firm exactly in this local market. Some market are really small. If you divide by district, could be 1 firm or even 0 firm. The other thing is that when we think about local labor market definition here, as we will show in empirical approach, we do not, when you think about more like structural estimations that you use labor market share, something like that, more specifically, then the market definition is really important in the IO literature. But we would just here we're going to show that we're going to use it to absorb the supply side. And maybe if you have more question, a little more concern or question, I can go to that slide and explain what we use for market definitions. Okay, so in terms of measurement, we measure. So because distortion here is the wedge between MRPL and wage, and usually wage is available in the firm level data set, the measurement problem is estimation of MRPL. And basically, a measurement of estimated MRPL is estimating revenue elasticity of labor. So what we do is we specify a revenue production function in log form as in equation 9. So revenue is function of capital, labor, and material, a Higgs neutral productivity term, omega IT and epsilon IT here is measurement errors. And we follow, and the identification problem here is that this omega IT productivity term is correlated with all the inputs. And typically in this literature, what IO people does is that they use a control function approach to control for this productivity. And we follow that approach. And in particular here, we use the method, identification and estimation method by this paper by Gandhi, Navarro, and River in JPE 2020. And this paper basically is use almost the same assumption at all, basically the same assumption and previous literature, but they use a little more, they exploit information a little more efficiently and without imposing any additional assumption to identify the model. So essentially here, we have control function omega here is productivity is an increasing function in material conditioning on capital and labor. So we can plug this M function here, and this typically comes from first order conditions with respect to material. And so we can plug in this omega IT term here into our production function to come up with equation 11 here. So in this equation, we don't have endogeneity anymore, but we have a problem of separating these two functions because both of these two functions are function of same argument. So the idea of Gandhi, Navarro, and River approach is that they use an additional moment in data, which is the material shape output, and take when first order condition suggests that material shape output is going to be informative about the revenue elasticity with respect to material. So they use that additional moment to identify this revenue elasticity with respect to material function F. So if we know the slope of function F, we can integrate this up and separate out these two functions. So that's the idea of this approach. Whereas other approach, traditional you see a lot in this literature is to separate out these two functions. One could impose functional form assumption on this function F to separate out this control function and the function that we want to identify. So we follow this approach. There's some more assumption that wanted to impose to identify the model through Markov process, but this is very typical in productivity literature. We also control for, in the Markov process, we also control for a vector of firm characteristic, including firm ownership, industry year, and location year fixed effects to control for some possible heterogeneity that is not controlled by this non-parametric functions. So with that, that's the baseline measurements.
Great.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Is
Yeah.
it, given this approach, this seems like reasonable, but what can go wrong in the sense that what if the tariffs also changes how firms use inputs or how they allocate between labor? So the model has only labor. In this estimation procedure of the basically estimating production function, there's also other inputs. So how do we reconcile the model where the tariff only changes, world price, but in practice you can think of a world where the BTA also changes how the firms allocate other inputs, like they may use more other things. Would that gonna challenge this estimation procedure, or is it gonna be all orthogonal?
So this is actually incorporated in here. That would be incorporated in here because here we don't assume, even though in the model we assume the tariff only affect the demand. Here, this model doesn't assume anything about how tariff affect production functions. So tariff could totally affect production functions in this, because this function f is allowed to be non-parametric. So you could allow it to change across firm and over time. So how firm combine this input is totally non-parametric, very flexible. So it's possible tariff can change production technology, and it would be incorporated in this estimation as well. The only one thing that can be a little more flexible that you can do is that you can allow for this function f to be a function of time. So this function f can be allowed to be a function of time ft that allow that production technology to change even more of time. So its function f is already non-parametric. So whatever technology the firm used to combine this input is incorporated in that f. But you could, one thing you could extend is you could allow this f to be ft. So you can have ft before and after the tariff, right? Production, you can allow that to change a little bit, but identification would be a little more, you require more heavy, either a little more assumptions or a little more data to identify this ft. But this function doesn't assume anything about how tariff affect. So if tariff affect technology, then it's already incorporated in here. Yeah, so now, so that's our baseline measure. And we extend the model to allow for 2 inputs. So basically, instead of incorporate labor as one factor production, you could allow it to non-parametrically enter production function as U and V separately for men and women, number of men and women employed. So one more thing we'd like to mention, because when we extend the model to measure distortion separately for men and women, we need wage paid separately to men and women, and that require the wage bill paid separately to men and women for each firm. We only have average wage information for each firm, so we have to estimate that wage premium that firm pays to men and women. So to estimate gender wage gap at firm level in manufacturing, we use this accounting identity where average wage is essentially weighted average of wage bill that paid to men and women. So it's going to be a function of wage premium paid to men and women and the share of men or women in the labor force compositions. So we can use a cost section of firm in a certain market and use the information on average wage and share and labor force composition to estimate this wage premium. So essentially, we reverse log average wage a firm on the share to estimate this premium, and we control for a polynomial of firm size, firm ownership, location fixed effect to account for firm heterogeneity in estimating this wage premium. So think about this as a sort of means of wage regression, but instead of individual level, we run it on firm level. So this share, instead of dummy 0,1, we share is a continuous variable. So we estimate for each industry by ESL, we estimate this wage premium. So this is another reason why I haven't answered one of your questions. That is why 2-digit is that we estimate the 2-digit. We go with 2-digit here because if we go to 4-digit, in principle, this is possible, but we cannot. We do not have enough firm for many cells to estimate the wage premium. So 2-digit, you have enough firm for each industry by year cell to estimate that wage premium. Sometimes we also have tried a couple of specification where we use moving average. So for example, if not enough observation, if it's not precise, we move average, let's say 2000, 2001, combine as one cell and treat that as wage for premium for 2000, and we use 2001, 2002, treat that for 2001. So kind of moving average and test that. It doesn't affect our result. It affects some of the level in terms of how much wage inequality it is, but over time it doesn't affect our result because we always have firm fixed effect that control for firm heterogeneity in our regression. So it doesn't affect our regression result. But so that's one drawback of this data set, that we need to estimate this wage premium. Okay, so let me move ahead to measurement result. So first in baseline result, where we measure distortions overall, Panel A show the histogram of the log of this distortion for the whole sample. So when there's no distortion, this log X should be equal to 0. And we plot the distribution of this our log X here. And what we see here is that the distribution of this log distortion is over sort of substantially on the right side of this 0 benchmark. We find that the median level of chi in the whole sample is 1.7, implying that worker get paid 59% of the MRPL at the median firm. The mean is not too far away. Mean is 1.64, imply that worker get paid only 61% of the MRPL. So basically, marginal product, if there's productivity shock that increase marginal product by $1, marginal revenue product by $1, 59 cents go to worker in the form of wage payment, and the other either enter firm profits or other form of distortion payment. Throughout we use median, but the mean doesn't change much, but the median is less sort of suffer from in this type of estimations, markup or markdown. Usually they have a lot of noise, and using median is suffer less from sort of outlier problem. So we use medians for a lot of descriptive statistic using graphical in our subsequent illustration. So on the right panel, we show the distribution of log X over time. What we see is that over time from 2000 to 2010, this distortion decreased significantly, decreased by 35 log points. And it's shift closer towards 0. So there's a decline in distortion, and the whole distribution is shift closer and closer to 0. And what happened here is that even though MRPL rise, but the weights rise faster than MRPL, so it lead to decline in distortion over time. We can show some correlations between this measured distortion and firm characteristic. And one couple of things I would like to highlight here is that more productive firm is usually more distorted in the labor market. Condition and productivity firm that hiring more women is more distorted in labor market. Firm that located more concentrated labor market, also more distorted. Domestic private firm also more distorted. Foreign owned is not more distorted relative to the base here view of this is SOE firm. Foreign firm is not more distorted compared to SOE firm. So when
sorry, I thought that you did the whole estimation using only domestic private firms, because that's basically what the model assumption is. Now I see this foreign owned. It's I guess you can do you can separate. I guess I didn't understand that the whole estimation was done in the entire stack, like all ownerships.
No, yeah. So the model is like that, but we estimate this for all type firm. We control for firm ownership. We also have a separate estimation in robustness check that we estimate the model for just domestic private firm. But here we would assume that firm behaves, as of course SOE and FDI firm would behave a little bit differently. But profit maximization, private owned firm, foreign owned would do the same thing. There's a little bit different in terms of market for foreign owned firm, which is a good point. And we also check robustness for where we estimate just for private owned firm that for subsequent analysis that we're going to show.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Another question, sorry.
Yeah.
So the tariff cannot change the eta, right? They only can influence this eta is like the labor supply elasticity. So that's the assumption that we can actually get this result. Otherwise, it's not possible to disentangle the eta from the chi.
Yeah, no. Yeah, there's nothing that disentangle eta from the chi. Yeah. So if we look at sort of this measurement separately for men and women, here on this panel A, we plot the distribution distortion for men versus women, and you can see that distribution distortion for women is stochastically dominate distortion distribution for men throughout our sample. if we look at the trend of distribution for distortion for men and women over time, we see that both are declining over time. So labor market is more competitive for both men and women, but the decline is more significant for women because women has higher distortion to start with. We find that average distortion for women is 26% higher than men, and the distortionary gap decreased from 29% to 21%. But one more thing I would like to show you where that distortionary gap decline is that. So if we look at MRPL gap and wage gap here, MRPL gap actually not changing much, and of course there's a lot of variation, but the median doesn't really different from that, detached that much from zero. A lot of this distortion gap is coming from wage pay difference, and this wage pay difference is declining over time. So that's where the distortion decline coming from. So now with that measurement step complete, now we're going to move on to regression analysis, where we estimate the effect of BTA on distortions of firm in manufacturing firms. So we run a simple difference in difference model where we use tariff exposure across industry as the shock, tariff gap, BTA gap, and we control for firm fixed effects, and we control for province year fixed effects here. And province year fixed effect here. So this is go back to the question you asked, why locations unit is province. So when we define local labor market at province, the idea was, of course, we have to have conceptual sort of how labor market work in reality. Another thing we use for location at province level is that we use this market definition on supply side to absorb the supply shock. So what our question here we want to see is we want to examine whether this pure demand shock from the trade shock, how pure demand shock from trade shock affect labor market distortions. So we control for firm fixed effect, and we control for province year fixed effect here to absorb all the supply shock. The same, that is common to all province, but and the shock and the tariff here is tariff variation across the two industries. So with that model, we examine several outcomes. So one of the first outcome we examine here to support our theoretical model and what we have in mind is that the firm entry channel. So we look at we investigate whether BTA induce entry or an exit to local labor market. So we regress entry count, exit count, firm count, and labor market shares at the market level on the BTA tariff, and we find that following the BTA tariffs, BTA tariff induced significant entry into local labor market. At the same time, it also induced more exit firm across the local labor market. On net, the firm count actually increased because entry was more than exit. So after the shock, the BTA create more firm in average local labor market, and average labor market share decreased following the BTA. Now, our main result, we look at several outcomes for firm, employment, wage, MRPL, and the log of distortions. So what we see is that following the BTA, industries that more firm industries that more exposed to tariff see significant increase in employment. They see increase in wage, but this wage increase is not as strong. And as we'll show in the dynamic version of this, we see initial increase in wage, but then the effect on wage become mute. Some effect on MRPL is insignificant, and we find the significant effect on distortion. So here positive mean decline and negative mean increase because tariff is decreasing. What we find is that the average distortions decrease by about 3.4% because of the BTA. So one way we can think about the magnitude of this effect is that if holding everything else constant, the fact that there's entry following the BTA here permanently correct for distortion in labor market by 3.4%. So holding, if we go back to labor share equation in the beginning, holding everything else, make labor share increase permanently by 3.4%. You could also think that, you know, real wage for worker increased by 3.4% through this particular channel. Now, here is a dynamic version of that difference in difference model. And we basically decompose effect by year to see whether there any pre-trend and the effect over time. So employment effect is very consistent. This is from raw data, and you know we can see very consistent effect right here, where we have immediate effect on employment, and then the effect gets stronger over time, and then remain quite strong over time. Effect on wage, initially there's an increase in wage for immediately right after the BTA, and this effect become mute over time. So this is consistent with upward sloping labor supply curve, and in the long run, if you wait long enough, the labor supply curve is going to be horizontal. MIPL, this leads industries that more exposed to MIPL see a slow growth in MIPL over time, and the distortion that translates, the combination of MIPL and wage here translate to decline distortions over time for firm that expose more to the BTA tariff. The measure distortion here is a little more noisy, but the effect is still quite consistent in this dynamic specifications. When we look at the result for men and women, what we see here is that decomposed effect by men and women, we rest this outcome separately. We see that effect on women is much stronger than relative to men. For example, for employment effect, the effect for employment is more than double the effect on employment for men. Similarly, we see significant rise in wage for women, and MIPL and distortion here for women capture all the effect rather than effect for men. What we find is that reduction in average distortion for manufacturing women is about 12.15%. So this driving the decrease in distortion for all type workers, 3.4% that we find in our baseline model. So those are the results that we find from our measurements. Now, one question we might ask further is that what are some practical mechanism or channel for the BTA to affect labor market distortion? So the effect could be driven by some specific industries where women might have a comparative advantage. And indeed, if we look at some industry where women have traditionally think of having comparative advantage, such as textile, fur, and leather. And we define comparative advantage here as, you know, if the share pre-BTA for these industries for women pre-BTA is greater than 70%, but the result robust to 50% benchmark as well. So if we look at differential effect on export for this industry relative to other industry, we see that this industry where women have comparative advantage here see more increase in export. So if we look at the same regressions that I present in the beginning for export and decompose it by two groups, the group that women has comparative advantage here has quite much larger effect compared to other group of industry. So it's possible that, you know, this industry is driving the result. So what we do is sort of interact the BTA tariff with the industries dummy where women have comparative advantage. And what we see is that it's actually not these industries that are driving the result. What we see is that actually the effect spread out to all industries, not just driven by the industry that traditionally hiring more women. So the entry effect appear not just where this industry is, you know, particular well suited for women, but appear in many across the board. The other reason that one can think of in sort of context of Vietnam is that the effect could be driven by certain type of firms, such as whether it's SOE, domestic, private firm, or foreign-owned firm. So we run regressions separately for these type of firm, and we find that it actually the effect concentrates on domestic private firm. SOE firm doesn't react to this market change at all. And foreigner-owned firm also do not react to these changes. So it is domestic private firm that is react to market incentive here. SOE firm doesn't react to market incentive here is not surprising. We see that result before. Given the incentive of SOE. What is interesting we find is that foreign-owned firm, they doesn't change, they don't react to this. And of course, there's a caveat to this. A lot of FBI firm enter after the BTA is and go into force. So they enter, but they do not change behavior after they enter. That's what we find here. So in terms of FBI firm here, a recent paper by Marquette, Pagnik, and Wong, 2023, shows that BTA significantly increased FBI entry and FBI employment share. And a lot of growth is sort of in manufacturing can be attributed to the FBI firms. What we find here is that we find similar results. So FBI have played a significant role in shaping the employment compositions in Vietnam manufacturing. So if we control for FBI employment share 2-digit level, we see that FBI employment share here absorb most of the effect that we find in our baseline model, except for some employments to stay, but a lot of other effect was absorbed by FBI firm entry. So take this in combination of this previous result, what we see is that FBI firm enter. When they enter as a big firm, and they make private domestic firm become more competitive in labor market. So they force those firms to be more competitive. But once they enter, at least in our sample period from 2000 to 2010, once they enter, they have a certain level of market distortion how they behave, and then they behave the same way over time until 2010. They didn't change their behavior. If anything, their distortions, of course, is insignificant, so we cannot interpret that, but it is possible they impose a competition effect on the private domestic firm, and they could even exercise more market power once they realize that they can accept they're a big employer and they can exercise a little more market power over the local workers. Okay, so that's main result of this paper. The key takeaways that I would like to summarize is that manufacturing worker get paid 59% of MIPR of the median firm. Trade shock can endogenously affect distortion in the labor market, and it has implication for inequality labor share and misallocation through the channel. BTA reduced distortion by about 3.4%, largely driven by the decline distortion for manufacturing women, about 12.15%. And this is shed a little light on how sort of a little more mechanism on how trade affect gender wage inequality. Future work or iteration could explore aggregate implication in terms of welfare and spill over to other sectors. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm sorry. So I tend to ramble on, but if you have any questions, please feel free to tell me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hoang, for your presentation. The floor is basically open now for questions. I will maybe there was one that was written in the chat sort of partway through the presentation, so maybe I'll just start. I'll recap that one, and then we'll just kind of open the questions to the floor. Well, sorry, where was it there? Okay. Sorry. Oh yeah, so Margaret McMillan had a question about labor market institutions in this context, such as minimum wages and unions, and how do they affect essentially your interpretation of these of the results in this context?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. So labor market institution also changed quite a bit during this time. So during this time period, of course, we have change in the HOCO system. That's quite a significant change in 2005, 2006. Also, minimum wage rise consistently throughout this period. So certainly, labor market institution is actually what is underlying this labor market distortion. So change in this labor market institution will certainly affect labor market distortions. So one thing that in our analysis, because we focus on the demand side, So that's why we have this control that is quite important to us, is the proven year fixed effect. So what we want to do here when we run these regressions, what we do was we want to control for the supply side. So all of these labor market institutions, such as HOCO policy, minimum wage, usually at the market level, local market level, the sort of location level. So for example, if minimum wage or even immigration, something like barriers to migration changing at province level, those would enter this province year fixed effect. So we, in our paper, we kind of try to control for supply side. So that's why we control for province year fixed effect here, and to focus on the demand side, on the effective trade. But one good thing, if this one good thing that's, effect of minimum wage, local policy would work through this province year fixed effect and can affect labor market distortion separately if one do not control for this province year fixed effect. So certainly significant change in labor market institution can affect labor market distortion. So we control for that, but of course, we don't know if even this control is, super adequate, because there might be change at even more refined level, at the more disaggregate level, local labor market that could affect our interpretations. So in our case, we just think that, the industry level is shock. That's why we use industry level shock rather than some researchers that can think about this as using a shift share approach. But shift share approach can contain certain supply side factor that could affect labor market distortion. So that's why this design we go with the industry approach rather than more like local labor market, like shift share approach, that make it a little bit harder because it contains some general equilibrium effect that we cannot tease out between demand and supply. So yeah, so that.
I have some questions.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Great presentation and really cool result. And so I have 3 questions. Would you prefer if I just kind of ask them all at once, or should we go like one by one?
You can ask them all at once and I can.
Okay, cool. So with the motivation, I think, when you kind of link like the decline labor share with like increased trade, I think like one kind of very established result in trade is that, export firm tend to have like technological upgrading, right? So would that be like a potential kind of explanation for that linkage, and I feel like especially with the equation that you had on the first slide, you are assuming constant return to scale, right? So if we don't have that kind of assumption, then it will change. So yeah, I guess I know it's not super relevant because it's kind of like a motivation, but I kind of just like want to point out that like there might be some other explanation, not just labor market distortion is the story here. Yeah, and then with the second question, I think you kind of addressed it a little bit already, but I wanted to ask whether you tried with the measurement of trade shock at the local labor market level. So you already addressed like the kind of general equilibrium kind of effect, can you kind of want to control for the supply side? But my question is, if you just use tariff change at the industry level as the trade shock, then we are not really kind of maybe paying attention to some sort of like linkages between like backward, upward, like linkages, industry linkages, right? Like even if an industry has like a very small tariff reduction, but maybe if it like provide supply for another industry, then that could be, another kind of trade shock too. So that's kind of the second question. And then the third one is whether you have kind of included maybe like industry year fixed effect in your main specification. My main concern is just like maybe there's some kind of global effect that affect industry during that time span, so I know you have like firm fixed effects. I think you have year and time fixed effects. So I'm just wondering whether you have industry by year fixed effect, for example, in the main specification.
Yeah, thank you for the questions, Ngan.
Yeah.
So So first question, so the first one, when you talk about exporting technology, is totally relevant. So it's actually, so when you think about technology and export, firm have different technology. So when exporting firm more productive, then it wouldn't affect labor share. What matters is whether that technology is more biased towards certain tariff factor production. So if you have biased technology, then this will affect this theta L term. And then, those can affect labor share or labor market outcome, right? So through that channel. So certainly some kind of biased technology exporting firm adopt can affect labor share. So what we do in our paper is we already kind of control for that, but by focus on when we measure MRPL, we didn't specify whether technology have to be a certain way, right? So it's totally non-parametric. That the revenue elasticity with respect to labor is totally non-parametric, and we doesn't specify how they're different between export and non-exporting firm. But you're right. So if you do, if you think about exporting firm, and if there's a way to decompose that, then you might be able to learn a little more. So in our case here, we kind of capture that in that MRPL, but you could learn some more by trying to have an exporting dummy, for example, and interact with estimate that sort of nonlinear effect of exporting on the labor elasticity to see that capture. But in any case, that would enter, both of that would enter this one. And then when we say we compute chi here, we take this divided by that. So it's basically incorporated in that. So think about this way, because MRPL divided by wage, right? So if there's a bias technology in that enter this one right here, if labor market is perfectly competitive, that bias would also enter the wage payment. So if I augment certain factor more than other factors, then I would pay, if market is perfectly competitive, I would pay that factor the same amount more compared to other factor as well. But if market is, but it is the wedge between them that normalize those difference. So that's the first one. The second one is really also relevant. So in the beginning draft of this paper, we also have some spillover. We study some spillover, but and we find some spillover to other sector. So you can think about one industry gets shocked, and other industries located in the same province, for example, get also competition effect from this one industry. But we kind of remove that because it kind of distract focus of the paper, and we get feedback that what do you want to focus on. So that could be an extensions, but we didn't include that in this paper. And then input output network is certainly very important, not just in distortion but productivity and so on. Industry year, we cannot include that here because our shock is at industry year level. So if we include that industry year, fixed effect would absorb the tariff variation. So our shock is that industry by year level. So if we include that industry year fixed effect, it would absorb the variation. So we could not include that. Yeah.
Sorry,
so we have
so
firm and province
yeah.
years.
With the tariff reduction, I thought it's a one-time thing. It's a movement between column 2 to column 1. So it's like time invariant, right? But then you're saying that the tariff reduction actually vary by year?
Yeah, so that is one-time change. But when we think about the shock, is a time variant, right? So that's one-time change, but it's just one-time change, but then you high and then you low, but you keep low. So basically it's over time. It's not just one time, right? It's just over time.
Yeah,
It's just over time, but it just
that interaction will go away. Yeah,
in the direction.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Hoàng. I just want to say hi and nice to see you, and thank you for the great talk. I have a question regarding, so in 2007, Vietnam also joined the WTO, and tariffs at that time also decreased. Did you look at like the role of that events in the story, or do you have any insight about that?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at yet at the WTO. How does that affect the distortion? We just sort of do a check, but what we find is very little correlations in Vietnam tariff reduction with the BTA tariff reductions. So it doesn't affect our result when we include in these regressions, but we didn't really settle down and try to examine the effect of that trade episode on labor market distortions. Yeah, so that trade episode could I think if that trade episode affect distortions, import competition is one effect that could induce exit, but at that time, WTO tariff reduction was like 3 to 4%, I think, in magnitude, but it's not as large as this episode. So I think at that time when I didn't see any very comprehensive study on this trade episode, but I think the WTO episode, one of the things significant about that was access to input. That at that time that Vietnam has more access to input, that is significant. But I didn't think I don't remember it's some study, not very comprehensive one, but some study document that some effect, but it's not very strong effect on the trade pattern of Vietnam when Vietnam joined WTO. But I could be wrong. This is my impression. Yeah. Is there anyone have additional questions? How are you guys doing?
I think maybe we can just like end it here and then we can talk
Yeah.
with the recording off, and whoever wanted to go can go. I'd love to talk to you more.
It's nice to connect with you. And thank you, Brian, for organizing this for us to connect as well. An opportunity for us to connect.
I think Brian is frozen, so
Yeah,
I think it's not.
I think we kind of lost Brian a little bit. Yeah, and thank you all for all your questions. It's nice to connect, everyone. Thank you. Nghiêm, Chi Linh. It's nice to see you again. Ngan, nice to see you again. And I know I connected with some people. So yeah.
Great job, Anh Hoang. I'm gonna log off for now.
Yeah. See you.
Okay, talk to you later.
Oh, he's gone.
Yeah, I think Brian lost connection and people are logging off. If anyone want to connect, please feel free to connect.
Could you turn off the recording?
Oh yeah.
As a host.
Let's see. I do not know how to turn off. Okay.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, we'll probably harder.
I think you should turn off turn off forget the screenshot, the screen sharing.